Pete Carroll is back in the NFL, and this could have some meaning for the Seahawks as well. Carroll needs a quarterback in Vegas. Now, the Raiders have the number 6 overall pick. They could consider drafting a quarterback. Even if they do that, having a bridge would be useful. But there's also no guarantee that the top 2 quarterbacks in the 2025 draft are going to last to number 6. So it will make some sense for the Raiders to add a quarterback between now and the draft. A lot of people in the national media are connecting Russell Wilson to the Raiders, and maybe that would happen. He is going to be available. It's not clear whether the Steelers are going to bring Russell Wilson back. I suppose that it's a possibility. But I think Pete Carroll might go after Geno Smith instead. We've been talking about it for a couple of weeks, ever since Carroll's name was linked with the Raiders. Why is this perhaps more likely? Well, Carroll said in the past, when he was the Seahawks head coach, that Smith was one of his favorite players that he had ever worked with. And I think it's because he sees themselves as almost as kindred spirits. You know, Carroll had to go to USC to rebuild his career after things hadn't worked out with the Patriots and the Jets. He did that. He then went back to the NFL and had further success, won a Super Bowl with the Seahawks. Geno Smith struggled with the Jets, kind of bounced around the league as a backup, and has then rebuilt his career in Seattle. And I think for that reason, Carroll looks at Smith and thinks, I kind of see a bit of myself in him. And then on top of that, I think Carroll was left a little bit upset with the way that things ended with Russell Wilson. And then Smith was the next guy. And I think he appreciates that and appreciates how Smith handled that situation, took things on, and was very competitive, especially in that first season post-Russell Wilson, where the Seahawks had a good season or a good half season from Geno Smith before things tailed off a little bit in that second half of the season. But it's pretty clear that Pete Carroll was always a huge backer of Geno Smith, more so, in my opinion, than John Schneider was. I've never got the sense that Schneider was completely bought into Geno Smith, which is why a year ago there were several press conferences where Schneider simply wouldn't even talk about Geno Smith and would often turn the conversation back to Drew Lock. It's why we had that tweet from Adam Schefter, which mentioned Smith's value in his contract to the Seahawks or any other team that would be interested in acquiring him via trade. It very much felt like the Seahawks put the feelers out last year about, hey, if you are interested in trading for Geno Smith, we're open to having a conversation. And clearly there wasn't much of a market there. A lot of quarterbacks went early in the draft. Perhaps some of those teams who needed a QB were just saying, we'll just go in a different direction here. We're just going to go and draft somebody. And this is a very different draft year. There are not going to be, 4 or 5 quarterbacks who go in the top 12 this year. It may be 2. It may be less than 2. I think there's every chance that we may just see 1 quarterback go early in this draft. So I think it's a very different situation. There are teams who need quarterbacks, the Raiders being one of them. And there may be teams who think, yeah, do you know what? We're willing to chuck a pick Seattle's way, acquire Geno Smith, and we'll have him as our bridge. And perhaps the Seahawks in a slightly different situation, a slightly different time frame with a GM who doesn't necessarily want to pay Geno Smith a big new contract, they might be prepared to move on. So I think there is going to be potentially a conversation between now and the start of free agency. You would imagine that would most likely happen at the Combine, where maybe the new GM of the Raiders and John Schneider and Pete Carroll sit down and go, what's it going to take to get this deal done? Now, the important thing to remember here is I think the Seahawks are very open-minded. Despite everything I've just said about John Schneider and Geno Smith, I think they're very open-minded about retaining Geno as their starter, at least for another year. But what I think it's going to take is another compromise contract where the Seahawks have options to get out of the deal at the end of every season. I think they are comfortable having him as a bridge, but nothing more. What they don't want to do is commit huge amounts of salary, huge amounts of term, like 2-3 years guaranteed, to Geno Smith. I don't think they want to have him as the quote-unquote franchise quarterback in terms of the contract. I don't think they want to pay him $40 million, $50 million a year. I think they want to come to a compromise arrangement, which is very flexible, which is probably laden with incentives again, and gives the team a wiggle room at the end of every season to move on if they want to. And Geno Smith may just think, I don't want that. I want more security. I want more money. I don't want to go year to year. So you're going to have to make a decision here. Are you going to cut me, or are you going to pay me, or are you going to trade me? So the fact that he now has an ally in Las Vegas with a team that needs a quarterback speaks to some leverage that Geno has to go, if you are not willing to pay me, let me go somewhere else. And that will make things, I think, a little bit difficult for the Seahawks to negotiate with Geno Smith. Because if the Raiders, who've got, I think, the second most cap space this year and the most cap space at the moment for next year, they can go, hey, Geno, we'll have you for 3 years. We'll make that commitment that the Seahawks won't make, and we'll have you for 3 years as we try and completely rebuild a program. Because the Raiders right now are in a very similar position to where the Seahawks were in 2010. They've got a couple of good players, really good players in Brock Bowers and Max Crosby. A few others, the left tackle's not too bad, one or two others as well. But it's going to be a sort of a 2 or 3 year process, this, I think, to get the team to where they need to be. So it would make sense for them, a bit more sense, I would say, to pay Geno Smith a bit more than, say, the Seahawks would do, where the Seahawks are in a, I don't know, I perhaps do not have a coach who is completely in the way that Carroll was with Geno Smith, although Mike Macdonald's clearly a fan of Geno Smith, and a GM who's not completely bought into him might think, yeah, we're happy to keep you, but at our price, not with a $44.5 million cap hit this year, and without the flexibility to move on if and when we want to. And let's not forget, John Schneider is a GM who has moved on from Matt Hasselbeck. He moved on from Matt Flynn after signing him, and they went straight to Russell Wilson. They moved on for Russell Wilson and did not have a clear plan. This is the thing that people keep saying, well, how can they move off Geno Smith? There's no better option out there. There's no plan for the Seahawks. Well, they didn't have a plan when they traded Russell Wilson. They just traded Russell Wilson, brought in Drew Lock, re-signed Geno Smith, and went, okay, you two, best man wins. So I don't think there's any reason why the Seahawks would be afraid of trading Geno Smith in a similar situation, bringing in a couple of guys and having a go. And there's Sam Darnold's potentially going to be a free agent. I think that's more likely than not at this stage. You've got the draft. You've got other veterans out there who the Seahawks might be interested in. They could trade for somebody. There's a lot of things that are potentially on the table here. So a lot of water is going to go under the bridge. I'm just saying that it will not be a huge surprise if, given the combine, there's increasing buzz that Pete Carroll is interested in reuniting with Geno Smith, taking him to Las Vegas, that the Raiders are more prepared to give Geno the kind of contract that he's looking for. That makes it harder for the Seahawks to get a deal done in Seattle. Therefore, they take what they can get in a trade, and they too move on and go in a different direction at the quarterback position. I think that is a completely plausible situation. So the final thought on this is, what kind of compensation could the Seahawks realistically get? Well, Matt Ryan, who was 37, so a couple of years older than Geno Smith, when he left Atlanta to go to the Indianapolis Colts, the Falcons got a third-round pick for Matt Ryan. So I think that's a fair kind of price. The Raiders, as it happens, have 2 third-round picks this year. So if they were willing to give the Seahawks a third-round pick and maybe something else just to sweeten the pot a little bit, because as I mentioned, he's a couple of years younger than Matt Ryan. He's a great athlete. Matt Ryan, when he went to the Colts, I think they were drafting him for his head more than his physical qualities. With Geno Smith, the physical traits are still there, evidently still there. So maybe it's a third and a fourth, or maybe it's a third and something in the 2026 draft, or maybe it's a swap of picks in round 2 and the third, which is the same as the Charlie Whitehurst trade that we saw with the Seahawks in 2010. There's all kind of things that could happen there. But, that's the kind of price range that I think you were looking at. And look, even if you just got a third-round pick from a high third-round pick in this draft, which is going to be deep in day 2, that has got a lot of offensive linemen available, a lot of defensive linemen available, a lot of tight ends, the kind of positions that the Seahawks are going to be wanting to add into, I think that would be quite an attractive move for the Seahawks. And then they would save money. They could potentially go in a different direction. I've talked about this before. I do think John Schneider will have some interest in Sam Darnold if he reaches free agency. So I think that's just something to keep an eye on. Anyway, that's my thoughts. I think that Geno Smith to the Raiders is a realistic prospect. What do you think? Let me know in the comments section. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe. And for more analysis, make sure you visit SeahawksDraftBlog.com.